Guys, today I witnessed the most insane Karen meltdown of my life. This HOA president showed up uninvited, started barking orders like she owned the place, and within minutes had escalated things to the point of calling the cops. Over a locked gate. My gate. On my land. Apparently being HOA president now comes with imaginary jurisdiction and a complete immunity to private property signs. What followed was so bizarre, I honestly thought I was on a hidden camera show. But nope, just another day in suburban nonsense. And trust me, it only got wilder from there. If your HOA has ever gone full dictator mode, drop a comment. I need to know I'm not the only one living next to the community enforcement squad with delusions of grandeur. Now let me take you back to how this whole circus started. My name is Wes Callahan, and 6 months ago I bought a 12-acre ranch in what I thought was the middle of nowhere, far enough from city drama to finally enjoy some peace and quiet. The property came with a beautiful old wooden gate, a weathered sign that read Callahan Ranch 1987, and the previous owner had left behind 3 gorgeous quarter horses that I'd fallen in love with immediately. I'd made my money in tech, saved up enough to retire early, and this ranch was supposed to be my sanctuary. The morning routine was simple: feed the horses, check the fence lines, and enjoy my coffee while watching the sunrise over the pasture. Life was perfect, or so I thought, until she showed up. I was out by the horse fence, brushing down my favorite horse, when I heard voices approaching from the dirt road that ran along my property line. Now, this wasn't unusual since there was an old walking trail that skirted the edge of my land, but what caught my attention was the fact that these voices were getting closer, and they definitely weren't staying on the trail. I looked up to see a woman in her late 30s leading a small group of people directly through my front gate and onto my property. She had disheveled clothes and messy hair, but what really caught my attention was the bright pink notebook she was carrying with obvious cartoon characters on the cover. "Excuse me," I called out, setting down my brush and walking toward the group. "This is private property. Can I help you with something?" The woman turned toward me with the most condescending expression I'd ever seen, her eyes narrowing as she looked me up and down like I was some kind of pest she needed to swat away. Behind her, 3 other people shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing that something wasn't quite right about this situation. The leader of this little expedition, however, seemed completely unbothered by my question. "This is the old walking trail from the 1980s, she announced, waving her hand dismissively in my direction. "You're new here, so just stay quiet and let us finish our community inspection." As she spoke, I got a better look at that notebook, and I kid you not, it was covered in Hello Kitty characters. She was taking this whole thing seriously, jotting down notes in her cartoon notebook while standing uninvited on my property. "I'm Denise Halford, president of Pine Ridge Estates HOA, and this is our monthly community walkthrough. I should have known any adult with a Hello Kitty notebook was here to destroy lives, not inspect trails." I couldn't help but stare at the Hello Kitty notebook for a moment before responding. "Ma'am, I appreciate that you have community responsibilities, but this isn't community property. This is my ranch, and you're standing in my front yard without permission." The other 3 people in her group began looking around nervously, and I heard one of them whisper, "Denise, are we allowed to be here?" But Denise wasn't backing down. Instead, she opened her Hello Kitty notebook and began writing furiously, muttering something about attitude violations and failure to cooperate with community leadership. "Listen here," she said, pointing the pen at me like it was some kind of weapon. "I've been managing this community for 3 years, and I know every inch of this area. This walking path has been used by residents since before you ever showed up with your horses and your attitude." Her voice was rising now, and I could see a couple of my neighbors from down the road starting to peek out of their houses to see what the commotion was about. One of them, an elderly woman named Martha Elkins, who lived in the small house closest to my property, was standing by her fence, shaking her head with obvious exasperation. The tension was getting thick, and I could tell this wasn't going to end well. "Ma'am, I'm going to ask you one more time to please leave my property. If you'd like to discuss community matters, you're welcome to call me, but right now you're trespassing." Denise's face turned bright red, and she snapped her Hello Kitty notebook shut with such force that I thought she might break it. "You'll regret arguing with the Hello Kitty president," she shouted, jabbing her finger in my direction. "Tomorrow you'll receive an official notice, and then we'll see how smart you think you are." With that, she spun around and marched back toward the road, her 3 followers trailing behind her like confused ducklings. I watched them go, noting how Denise's Hello Kitty notebook was flapping in the breeze as she gestured wildly, apparently giving her companions a lecture about difficult residents and proper community respect. Martha Elkins caught my eye from across the way and simply shrugged, as if to say, "Welcome to the neighborhood." As the group disappeared down the road, I had this sinking feeling that my peaceful ranch life was about to get a lot more complicated. The way Denise had clutched that ridiculous notebook like it contained nuclear launch codes told me everything I needed to know about what I was dealing with. But Wes had no idea what Denise was planning next. The next morning, I was enjoying my usual coffee and sunrise routine when I heard the distinctive sound of footsteps crunching up my gravel driveway. Through the kitchen window, I could see the mail carrier approaching with what looked like an oversized envelope, definitely not the usual bills and catalogs. When I opened the door to greet him, he handed me a manila envelope with urgent HOA violation notice written across the front in red marker, with little hearts dotting the I's. I opened the envelope right there on the porch, and what I found inside was both hilarious and concerning at the same time. The official notice was written on Hello Kitty stationery, and the content was even more bizarre than the presentation. "Dear Mr. Callahan," it began, "you have violated the community spirit by refusing to cooperate with the HOA management team. Each day you block community access and show disrespect. Hurts our neighborhood's spirit. Fine. $1,000 per day starting today. Payment due within 5 business days." The whole thing was signed with a flourish. Denise Halford, President, Pine Ridge Estates, HOA. Community spirit? Is that even a real violation? I said out loud, causing my horse to look up from his morning hay with what I swear was an amused expression. For a second, I actually wondered if she had some obscure municipal code on her side. Maybe there really was some ancient walking right I didn't know about. But then I remembered the Hello Kitty notebook and realized I was giving this woman way too much credit. This was getting ridiculous, and I decided it was time to do some research. I went inside, fired up my laptop, and spent the next hour diving deep into local property records and HOA documentation. What I discovered was going to change everything, and I could hardly believe what I was seeing on my screen. According to every official document I could find, county records, property surveys, and even the original HOA charter from 1995, my ranch was located completely outside the boundaries of Pine Ridge Estates HOA, not even close to the border, but a full quarter-mile beyond their jurisdiction. I double-checked the property lines, cross-referenced the addresses, and even called the local records office to confirm what I was seeing. The clerk confirmed what the documents showed. My property had never been part of any homeowners association. Armed with this information, I printed out copies of the official boundary maps and property surveys, then decided it was time for a friendly neighborhood conversation. I walked over to Denise's house, a modest 2-story that she apparently shared with her younger sister, and found her in the front yard with 4 other HOA members, apparently holding some kind of emergency meeting. They were all gathered around a folding table covered with papers, and Denise was gesticulating wildly with her Hello Kitty notebook, clearly worked up about something. "Excuse me, Mrs. Halford," I called out as I approached the group. "I received your letter this morning, and I was hoping we could clear up a small misunderstanding." Denise looked up from her notebook with a smug expression, clearly expecting me to apologize or offer to pay the ridiculous fine she'd invented. "I'm glad you've come to your senses," she said, crossing her arms. "The community doesn't tolerate disrespectful residents, and it's about time you learn to follow the rules like everyone else." I smiled and pulled out the property documents I'd printed. "Actually, I was wondering if you could help me understand something. According to these official county records, my ranch is located outside the Pine Ridge Estates HOA boundaries. In fact, it's never been part of any HOA. So I'm curious, how exactly can property that's not in your jurisdiction be subject to your fines?" The silence that followed was absolutely priceless. You could have heard a pin drop as the 4 other HOA members leaned in to look at the documents I was holding. One of them, a woman in her 50s, took a closer look at the boundary map and said, "Wait, Denise, is this accurate? His property really isn't in our HOA?" Another member, an elderly gentleman with a confused expression, added, "I thought you said all the properties in this area were part of our association." Denise's face was turning red again, but this time it was clearly embarrassment rather than anger. You don't understand anything," she stammered, snatching the papers from my hands. "I'm the president. I've been managing this community for 3 years. I know what properties are included." But the damage was done. I could see doubt creeping into the faces of the other HOA members as they looked back and forth between the official documents and their increasingly flustered president. "Actually," I said calmly, "I think there might be some confusion about your authority in this area. This letter you sent me, was this an official HOA fine or more like a personal opinion?" Told me I'd hit the nail on the head. Denise was practically vibrating with anger now, clutching her Hello Kitty notebook to her chest like it was some kind of shield. "I don't need to explain anything to you," she shouted. "I'm the president and what I say goes." With that, she turned and stormed into the house, slamming the door behind her so hard that I'm surprised it didn't come off its hinges. The remaining HOA members looked at each other awkwardly, then quietly gathered their papers and dispersed without another word. I could tell they were starting to question everything Denise had told them about her authority and the scope of their community rules. Denise was about to make her biggest mistake yet. 2 days after the boundary map incident, I was out checking the fence line when I spotted Denise marching up my driveway with a folder full of papers clutched in her hands. This time she was alone, which I took as either a good sign or a very bad sign. With Denise, it was hard to tell the difference. She had that same determined expression she'd worn during our first encounter, but there was something different about her demeanor. She seemed more desperate, more frantic, like someone who was running out of options and knew it. "Mr. Callahan," she called out before she'd even reached the porch, "I have proof of the community walking rights from 1985. You can't keep ignoring official documentation." She waved the folder in the air like it contained the secrets of the universe, and I could see that her hands were actually shaking slightly. When she got closer, I noticed that her clothes looked even more disheveled than usual, and her hair was escaping from its ponytail in wild wisps. I walked over to meet her, and she immediately thrust a stack of papers at me with the triumphant expression of someone who thinks they've just won the lottery. "Here," she announced. "This is the official easement documentation that gives the community walking rights through your property. It's been in effect since 1985, before you ever bought this place." I took the papers and immediately noticed several things that made my eyebrows raise. First, the documents appeared to be printed on different types of paper. Second, the fonts were inconsistent, with some sections in Times New Roman and others in Comic Sans. But the real giveaway was the letterhead, which read Pine Ridge HAO instead of Pine Ridge HOA. Either their legal department had made a pretty significant typo, or someone had been doing some creative document editing at home. "Denise," I said, looking up from the papers, "do you know how official easement documents are supposed to look?" She crossed her arms defensively. "Those are completely legitimate. If you don't believe them, then sue me." The challenge in her voice was unmistakable, but I could also hear a note of uncertainty creeping in. I pulled out my phone and called Martha Elkins, who had mentioned during a previous conversation that she'd lived in the area for over 30 years and might have some insight into local property history. "Martha, it's Wes. I'm sorry to bother you, but could you possibly check with the local records office about any easements on my property? Someone's claiming there's been a walking right in place since 1985. Martha's response was immediate and definitive. "Honey, I've been here since 1978, and there's never been any public walking path through that ranch. Let me make a quick call and get back to you." While I waited for Martha to call back, Denise stood in my driveway, tapping her foot impatiently and muttering things under her breath about difficult residents and community cooperation. When my phone rang 15 minutes later, Martha's voice was a mixture of amusement and disbelief. "Wes, I just spoke with the records office, and there's absolutely no easement on your property. Never has been. And honey, whoever made those documents you're looking at used Comic Sans font for official letterhead. Real government offices don't use Comic Sans for legal documents." That was the final straw. I'd been patient, I'd been reasonable, and I'd tried to handle this situation with diplomacy, but Denise was clearly committed to making my life difficult through fraud and harassment. It was time to take decisive action. "Denise," I said, handing the fake documents back to her, "I think it's time we establish some clear boundaries here. These documents are obviously fake, and your behavior is becoming increasingly concerning. I'm going to need you to stay off my property from now on." The look on her face was pure rage mixed with panic. "You can't do this to me," she screamed. "I'm the HOA president. I have rights." But I was already walking toward my truck, where I kept the supplies I'd been planning to use for a different project. It was time to install the ranch gate I'd been considering since I moved in. I'd installed the new gate not just for security, but also to watch what would happen when entitlement met metal. Call it a social experiment with steel reinforcement. Over the next 3 hours, I installed a sturdy steel gate with a digital lock system, along with 2 prominent signs: Pilgrim Ranch Property, No Trespassing, and Callahan Ranch, So Violators Will Be Prosecuted. I also set up a small security camera that would give me a clear view of the gate area. The whole time I was working, I could feel Denise watching me from her sister's house, probably plotting her next move. When Denise saw the locked gate later that evening, she'd apparently been driving by to check on the situation, she got out of her car and stood staring at it like it was some kind of personal insult. I watched from my kitchen window as she approached the gate, tested the lock, and then stood there for a full 5 minutes, just staring at the no trespassing signs. Finally, she pulled out her Hello Kitty notebook and started writing furiously, occasionally looking up at the gate with an expression of pure determination. When she finished writing, she looked directly at the security camera and shouted, "You can't keep me out forever! I'll find a way to make you pay for this!" The irony wasn't lost on me. Here was a woman who had spent weeks trying to assert authority she didn't have, over property she didn't own, and now she was threatening to make me pay for protecting my own land. I had a feeling that tomorrow was going to bring something special, and I was actually looking forward to seeing what creative solution Denise would come up with. What Denise did next shocked everyone. The next afternoon, I was inside the house, catching up on some reading, when I heard a strange rhythmic tapping sound coming from the direction of the front gate. At first, I thought it might be a woodpecker, or maybe one of the horses playing with something, but the sound was too regular and persistent to be natural. I looked out the front window and couldn't believe what I was seeing. Denise was standing at my locked gate with what appeared to be a small pink hammer, methodically hitting the lock like she was trying to break it open. I grabbed my phone and moved to a better vantage point where I could see the full scope of what was happening. Denise had come prepared for battle, armed with what I soon realized was a toy hammer, bright pink with Hello Kitty characters painted on the handle. She was wearing her usual stained purple sweater, but now it was paired with muddy jeans and oversized gardening gloves. The sight was both hilarious and concerning, like watching someone try to rob a bank with a water pistol. I had to give her credit for commitment to the Hello Kitty theme, even when committing what was technically vandalism. Tap, tap, tap went the little pink hammer against the steel lock, making about as much impact as a mosquito trying to knock down a tree. I could hear Denise muttering to herself as she worked, occasionally stepping back to examine her progress, then returning to her futile hammering with renewed determination. At one point, she tried a different approach and attempted to climb over the gate, but her loose jeans got caught on the steel bars, and she ended up hanging there awkwardly for several seconds before untangling herself. The whole scene was like watching someone who had never seen a lock before trying to solve the puzzle through brute force. Martha Elkins had apparently heard the commotion and was now standing in her own yard, watching the spectacle with the same fascination you might have for a particularly interesting car accident. She had her phone in her hand, clearly ready to call for help if the situation escalated beyond property damage into something more dangerous. Every few minutes, she would glance toward my house to see if I was aware of what was happening, and I gave her a small wave to let her know I was keeping an eye on things. I could see her shaking her head in disbelief at what 30 years of living in this neighborhood had never prepared her for. The hammering continued for about 10 more minutes, with Denise occasionally stopping to wipe sweat from her forehead and adjust her grip on the tiny pink weapon. It was clear that she was getting frustrated with her lack of progress, because she started hitting the lock harder and faster, creating a rapid-fire tap-tap-tap sound that was probably audible from 3 houses away. Finally, she stepped back, raised the Hello Kitty hammer high above her head, and prepared to deliver what she clearly hoped would be the decisive blow. This was my moment. That's when I decided to implement my master plan. I had installed the gate with a remote control system specifically for convenience, but I hadn't expected it to provide such perfect comedic timing. Just as Denise brought the hammer down with all her might, I pressed the button on my remote control. The gate swung open instantly, causing Denise to lose her balance and stumble forward with the momentum of her mighty swing. She flailed her arms wildly, trying to regain her footing, but physics was not on her side. Time seemed to slow down as I watched her inevitable collision with destiny. Splash! The sound echoed across the yard as Denise face-planted directly into the large mud puddle that had formed in front of the horse trough after yesterday's rain. The Hello Kitty hammer flew out of her hand and landed about 8 feet away in a patch of tall grass, while Denise herself emerged from the muddy water looking like she'd been wrestling with the horses themselves. Her hair was completely soaked and plastered to her head, and her face was covered in a layer of brown muck that made her look like some kind of swamp creature from a horror movie. I walked out of the house with what I hoped was an expression of genuine concern, though I'll admit it was hard to keep a straight face given the situation. "Denise, are you okay? Do you need me to call an ambulance?" I asked, reaching for my phone as if I was genuinely worried about her well-being. She struggled to her feet, spitting mud and wiping her eyes with the back of her muddy gloves, and I could see that her dignity had taken just as much of a hit as her physical appearance. Part of me felt bad. The other part remembered her fake fines and laughed louder. The universe had delivered perfect justice with impeccable timing. You did this on purpose, she sputtered, pointing an accusatory finger at me while mud dripped from her hair onto her shoulders. You humiliated me. You're going to pay for this. Martha had moved closer to the fence line and was now clearly struggling not to laugh at the spectacle. Denise, she called out in a voice that was trying very hard to sound sympathetic, maybe you should go home and get cleaned up. You've got mud in places that probably shouldn't have mud. I could see Martha covering her mouth with her hand, desperately trying to maintain some semblance of neighborly decorum. But Denise wasn't ready to admit defeat. She retrieved her Hello Kitty hammer from the grass, held it up like some kind of war trophy, and pointed it directly at me with the kind of dramatic flair usually reserved for courtroom dramas. I'm calling the police, she declared, her voice carrying across the yard with surprising authority, considering she looked like she'd just lost a fight with a swamp monster. With luck. You assaulted me. You set a trap. This is attempted murder. The way she said attempted murder while holding a toy hammer and dripping with horse trough mud was so absurd that I actually started to worry she might be having some kind of mental breakdown. The next phone call would change everything. 20 minutes after the mud puddle incident, I was inside cleaning up when I heard Denise's voice carrying across the yard from her sister's house. She was clearly on the phone with someone, and her voice had taken on a completely different tone. Gone was the aggressive HOA president, replaced by what sounded like a frightened victim seeking help. I moved to my front window where I could hear more clearly, and what I heard made me realize that this situation was about to escalate far beyond neighborhood drama. 911, I need help immediately, Denise was saying, her voice shaking with what sounded like genuine fear. My neighbor threatened me with a weapon and set up a trap that caused me to fall and injure myself. He's blocking public access with an illegal gate, and when I tried to use the community walking path, he attacked me. I could only hear one side of the conversation, but it was clear that she was painting a very different picture of what had just happened. The desperation in her voice was unmistakable. This wasn't just about winning an argument anymore. This was about a woman who had built her entire identity around being an HOA president and was now watching that identity crumble. The emergency operator must have asked for more details because Denise continued with increasing urgency. He's been harassing me for weeks. I am the HOA president and he refuses to follow community rules. Today he set up some kind of booby trap that made me fall into a mud pit and I think I might have a concussion. From my window I could see her pacing back and forth in her sister's yard, still covered in mud, but gesticulating wildly as she spoke. Her purple sweater was leaving muddy handprints on everything she touched, and her hair was still dripping dirty water onto the ground. I realized that I needed to be prepared for what was coming, so I called Martha immediately. Martha, I think Denise just called the police and told them I attacked her. You saw what really happened, right? Martha's response was both reassuring and concerning. Honey, I saw the whole thing. That woman tried to break your gate with a toy hammer and fell into a puddle when you opened it. But I also heard her on the phone, and she's telling a very different story. You better gather up any evidence you have because this is about to get serious. I spent the next 15 minutes preparing for what I knew would be a crucial conversation. I pulled the video footage from my security camera, printed out the property boundary documents I had shown the HOA members earlier, and gathered the fake easement papers that Denise had brought me. I also made sure I had the phone number for a local attorney ready, just in case things went sideways. The most important thing was to stay calm and let the facts speak for themselves. Within 20 minutes, I heard the unmistakable sound of a police cruiser coming up the road. Through my window, I could see Deputy Troy Maddox stepping out of his patrol car, a young officer I'd heard good things about from other neighbors. He was tall, professional-looking, and carried himself with the kind of calm confidence that suggested he'd dealt with neighbor disputes before. What happened next would determine whether justice would prevail or whether Denise's version of events would carry the day. Before Deputy Maddox could even reach my front door, Denise came running out of her sister's house like a woman possessed. She had changed out of her muddy clothes into a clean outfit, but her hair was still damp and there were still traces of mud under her fingernails. Officer, thank God you're here, she called out, practically throwing herself in front of the deputy. He's the one. He attacked me and set up illegal barriers to block public access. I'm the HOA president and I was just trying to do my job when he assaulted me. Deputy Maddox held up his hand in a gesture that clearly meant slow down, and I could see him taking in the scene. The locked gate, the no trespassing signs, and the still visible mud puddle where Denise had taken her tumble. Ma'am, I'm going to need to speak with both parties separately to understand what happened here. Can you please step back and let me assess the situation? His voice was calm but authoritative, and I felt a wave of relief that we were dealing with a professional who wasn't going to jump to conclusions. Denise clearly wasn't happy about being asked to wait, but she reluctantly stepped back while continuing to mutter things about community safety and illegal gate installations. I could see Martha positioning herself near her fence line, where she would be able to witness whatever conversation was about to take place. The deputy approached my front door and I opened it before he could knock. "Good afternoon, officer," I said, extending my hand. "I'm Wes Callahan, and I believe there's been some kind of misunderstanding about what happened here today." Deputy Maddox shook my hand and pulled out a small notebook. "Mr. Callahan, I've received a complaint that you threatened someone and set up some kind of trap that caused them to fall and injure themselves. The complainant also says you've illegally blocked public access. Can you tell me your version of what happened?" His tone was neutral and professional, giving no indication of whether he believed Denise's story or not. I took a deep breath and prepared to tell the truth, knowing that the next few minutes would determine the outcome of this entire bizarre situation. Who would the deputy believe? Deputy Troy Maddox stood on my front porch with his notebook ready, and I could see that he was taking this complaint seriously despite the unusual circumstances. Before I could say anything, however, Denise's voice rang out from across the yard where she was supposed to be waiting quietly. "Officer, you need to arrest him right now. He's a danger to the community." Deputy Maddox turned toward her with an expression of professional patience that suggested he'd dealt with overeager complainants before. "Ma'am, I asked you to wait while I speak with Mr. Callahan. I need to hear each side of the story separately to conduct a proper investigation." His voice carried just enough authority to make it clear that interrupting again would not be wise, and Denise reluctantly closed her mouth, though I could see her practically vibrating with the effort of staying quiet. The deputy turned back to me and gestured toward the gate area. "Sir, can you walk me through what happened here today?" I led Deputy Maddox toward the gate, explaining the situation step by step. "Officer, I have video footage of the entire incident from my security camera. Mrs. Halford came onto my property and attempted to break my gate lock with what appears to be a toy hammer. When she raised the hammer to strike the lock, I remotely opened the gate for safety reasons, and she lost her balance and fell into that mud puddle over there." I pointed to the still visible puddle, then pulled out my phone to show him the recorded footage. The deputy watched the video carefully, and I could see him struggling not to smile when the footage showed Denise wielding the bright pink Hello Kitty hammer. "Is that a toy hammer, sir?" he asked, rewinding the video to get a better look. "Yes, officer. It appears to be a children's toy, probably designed for play rather than actual construction work." The absurdity of the situation wasn't lost on either of us, but Deputy Maddox maintained his professional demeanor as he continued reviewing the evidence. "Mr. Callahan, Mrs. Halford claims this is public property and that you've illegally blocked access to a community walking path. Do you have documentation showing ownership of this land?" I handed him the property deed and the boundary maps I'd printed earlier. "Officer, this ranch has never been part of any HOA or community association. It's completely private property, and I have the county records to prove it." Deputy Maddox examined the documents carefully, then pulled out his own device to cross-section the property information with official records. After several minutes of checking and double-checking, the deputy looked up from his device with a clear expression of understanding. "Mr. Callahan, according to county records, this property is indeed privately owned and not subject to any homeowners association rules or community access requirements." He turned toward where Denise was waiting and called out, "Ma'am, can you please come over here? I need to ask you some questions about your claims." Denise practically ran over to where we were standing, clearly eager to present her side of the story. "Officer, I'm the president of Pine Ridge Estates HOA, and I've been managing this community for 3 years. This property has always been part of our walking trail system." But when Deputy Maddox showed her the same property records he'd just reviewed, her confidence began to visibly waver. "Ma'am, these official county records indicate that this property is not within your HOA boundaries and never has been. Can you provide documentation to support your claim?" The change in Denise's demeanor was immediate and dramatic. The angry, authoritative HOA president was suddenly replaced by a confused and increasingly desperate woman who clearly hadn't expected to be challenged with actual facts. That can't be right," she stammered, looking back and forth between the deputy and the documents. "I've been the president for 3 years. I know every property in our community." But Deputy Maddox wasn't swayed by her protests. "Ma'am, I also need to address the assault allegation you made when you called 911. In the security footage I just reviewed, I can see that Mr. Callahan was inside his house when you fell, and the fall appears to have been accidental when the gate opened. However, I can clearly see you attempting to damage his property with what appears to be a hammer. Denise's face went through several shades of red as the reality of her situation began to sink in. "Officer, you don't understand," she said, her voice taking on a pleading tone. "He's been harassing me. He refuses to follow community rules. He's disrupting the harmony of our neighborhood." But Deputy Maddox had clearly heard enough. "Ma'am, based on the evidence I've reviewed, the property records, the security footage, and witness statements, it appears that you have been trespassing on private property and attempting to damage Mr. Callahan's gate." I could see Martha Elkins approaching from her yard, clearly ready to provide her own witness testimony if needed. Deputy Maddox noticed her as well and called out, "Ma'am, did you witness what happened here today?" Martha nodded and walked over to join our conversation. "Officer, I've lived next door for 30 years and I saw the whole thing. Mrs. Halford has been harassing Mr. Callahan for weeks, claiming authority she doesn't have over property she doesn't manage." Deputy Troy was about to make his decision. Deputy Troy Maddox closed his notebook and looked directly at Denise with the kind of serious expression that law enforcement officers reserve for moments when they're about to deliver news that someone really doesn't want to hear. The afternoon sun was starting to cast long shadows across the ranch, and I could see that Martha was positioning herself where she could witness whatever was about to happen. This felt like one of those moments that would either restore sanity to my peaceful ranch life or escalate into something even more complicated. "Mrs. Halford," the deputy began, his voice carrying the weight of official authority. "Based on the evidence I've reviewed, the property records, the security camera footage, and witness testimony, I need to inform you that you are currently trespassing on private property." The words hit Denise like a physical blow, and I watched her face cycle through disbelief, anger, and what appeared to be genuine shock. "Officer, you don't understand," she protested, her voice rising to a pitch that probably startled the horses. "I'm the HOA president. I've been managing this community for 3 years. This man is lying to you." But Deputy Maddox wasn't finished. "Ma'am, the county records are very clear. This property has never been part of any homeowners association, and Mr. Callahan has every right to control access to his land. Furthermore, attempting to damage someone's gate with a hammer, even a toy hammer, constitutes attempted vandalism." He gestured toward the pink Hello Kitty hammer, which was still lying in the grass where it had landed after Denise's tumble. "I could arrest you right now for trespassing and attempted property damage." The word arrest seemed to hit Denise like a bucket of cold water. All the fight went out of her at once, and she suddenly looked less like an authoritative HOA president and more like a middle-aged woman who had gotten herself into a situation way over her head. This can't be happening," she whispered, looking around as if she expected someone to jump out and tell her this was all an elaborate prank. "I was just doing my job. I was trying to maintain community standards." Deputy Maddox pointed directly toward the road, his gesture unmistakably clear. "Ma'am, this isn't a request. You need to leave this property now." The firmness in his voice left no room for argument or negotiation. "And if you continue to harass Mr. Callahan or attempt to enter his property without permission, you will be arrested for stalking and criminal trespass. Do you understand me?" Denise stood there for a moment, swaying slightly, as if the words were physically pushing her backward. I watched as the full reality of the situation sank in for Denise. Her shoulders sagged, her defiant posture crumbled, and for the first time since I'd met her, she looked genuinely defeated. The wind picked up slightly, blowing her still damp hair across her face, and I could see that she was struggling not to cry. I understand," she said quietly, her voice barely audible. "I apologize for the misunderstanding." The words seemed to physically pain her, like she was admitting defeat in a war she'd been fighting her entire adult life. As Denise slowly walked toward the road, something fell from her bag and landed in the dirt. Her Hello Kitty notebook. She glanced back at it but kept walking, her steps growing more unsteady with each yard. She didn't even pick up the Hello Kitty notebook when it fell from her bag. It lay there in the dirt like a symbol of her unraveling, a childhood relic weaponized for suburban war, now defeated by reality. The pink cover was already getting dusty and pages were starting to flutter in the breeze, revealing weeks of angry notes about neighbors who had never actually been under her authority. Martha approached our little group with information that would put the final nail in the coffin of this bizarre situation. "Officer, I feel like I should mention that Mrs. Halford has done similar things to other families in the area. She put official-looking HOA notices on my car for parking in my own garage. And she called the city about my fence height even though my property isn't in any HOA either. This revelation seemed to confirm what Deputy Maddox had probably already suspected, that this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a pattern of behavior. "Ma'am," the deputy called out as Denise reached the edge of my property. "I'm filing a report about this incident. Any future harassment of Mr. Callahan or any other residents will result in immediate arrest. You might want to familiarize yourself with the actual boundaries of your HOA before you approach anyone else about violations." Denise didn't turn around or acknowledge the warning, but I could see her shoulders shaking as she walked away, whether from anger, embarrassment, or the delayed shock of nearly being arrested. After Denise disappeared around the corner, heading back to her sister's house, the mood in my front yard immediately lightened. Deputy Maddox turned to me with something approaching a smile. "Mr. Callahan, you handled this situation very professionally. Not everyone would have been so patient with that level of harassment." I thanked him for his thorough investigation and fair handling of what could have been a much more complicated situation. Funny how a clipboard and a fake title could turn a neighbor into a tyrant. It wasn't about rules, it was about control, and sometimes the smallest crowns create the worst kings. Within an hour of the deputy's departure, I had several visits from neighbors who wanted to apologize for Denise's behavior. Apparently, word of the incident had spread quickly through the neighborhood, and several residents had come forward with their own stories of questionable demands and fake violations from their now former president. A young couple from 3 houses down stopped by. The husband admitted, "She once fined us for leaving a stroller on the porch." His wife added, "We didn't even have kids back then. It belonged to my sister." They laughed, but there was still fear in it. The kind of nervous laughter that comes after surviving something you didn't fully understand was happening to you. Martha told me that an emergency HOA meeting had been called for the following evening to discuss removing Denise as president. Half the neighborhood didn't even know she was making up violations for properties outside our community, she said, shaking her head in disbelief. The other half were too scared to question her because she seemed so official. It was a reminder of how easily authority can be manufactured and how desperately some people want to believe that someone else is in charge of keeping order. As the sun set over Callahan Ranch that evening, I opened my gate and invited Martha and a few other neighbors to come see the horses and enjoy the peaceful evening. For the first time in 3 weeks, my property felt like the sanctuary I'd intended it to be when I bought it. The horses seemed to sense the change in atmosphere and were more relaxed than they'd been since the whole ordeal began. Even my most skittish horse let Martha feed him carrots, something he'd been too nervous to do while all the drama was happening. The lesson in all of this, I realized, was simple. Sometimes you don't need to fight crazy, you just need to let the truth speak for itself. Document everything, know your rights, and remember that bullies usually back down when confronted with facts and consequences. And if you're ever dealing with your own HOA Karen, invest in a good security camera system. You never know when you'll need video evidence of someone trying to break your gate with a Hello Kitty hammer. That night, I took down one of the no trespassing signs, not because I no longer valued boundaries, but because peace doesn't mean isolation. It just means knowing who's worth opening the gate for. As for Denise, I heard through the neighborhood grapevine that she moved out of her sister's house the following month, presumably to find a new community where she could start fresh. I hope she learned something from this experience, but honestly, that's not my problem anymore. My ranch is peaceful, my horses are happy, and my gate works perfectly, especially the remote control feature. And sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I swear I can still see that Hello Kitty notebook tumbling across the field like suburban tumbleweed. A reminder that even the smallest power trips eventually run out of road.